So we've been talking about different theories that motivate us. We've talked about instinct theory, we've talked about drive reduction theory, but there are other theories that explain what motivates people. One of those, and probably one of the most common explanations for motivation, is something called the incentive theory. This is one that you're like, okay, this one makes sense to me. This isn't so biologically based. The incentive theory basically says we're motivated when we have an incentive, something we want, that little carrot put in front of us, we're motivated to do something. A couple of years ago, my son was trying to make the high school soccer team. And one of the things that they said when he was getting ready to enter high school was he had to run the mile in a certain time and he had to have certain sprint times. And so he spent all summer working out, running, sprinting, distance running, etc., to try to get those times to where they wanted to be. In other words, he had an incentive. He had a thing, a carrot that was waving out in front of him, the idea of making the team, and that was put in front of him. Okay? So again, that is a motivating factor. Now, when you have a goal, you have something you want, it motivates you. Some people, for example, I know in the wintertime, always all these commercials come on, get your, it's wintertime, but get your beach body now. Start working out at, X gym or whatever. Again, I want to have a body that looks like this by summer. I have an incentive, so I go to the gym every day or whatever the case may be. So the incentive theory basically says there's some sort of external goal, some sort of, almost like a reinforcer, is being offered to you. So the incentive theory is just kind of a fancy name for, reinforcing to you, trying to get you to do stuff. We give you something to get you to perform a goal or to get to a goal. The other theory that we sometimes talk about is the arousal theory, sometimes known as the Yerkes-Dodson principle. The arousal theory says that sometimes our body is motivated actually when it's not in homeostasis. If you remember, homeostasis is when our body is in balance. But the Yerkes-Dodson principle, or the arousal theory, says sometimes we're motivated best when we are not in homeostasis state, but rather we are in an aroused state. Sometimes we need to be aroused. We need to get going. I know that a couple of times I've had the pleasure of being in the locker room for our high school's football team, kind of the pregame stuff. And we have a really good high school football coach, and he's really good at getting his teams going. And what he does is he gives these, these speeches that start off slow and they slowly begin to build, like any coach, and he gets them going. And by the time they're ready to run out of that locker room door, those guys are all ready to go, and they're hitting each other on the shoulder pads, and they're bashing helmets together, and everybody's going crazy, and they're ready to go out there on that field and just kill people. That is that idea of that aroused state. Sometimes we're motivated best, we work harder, we perform better when we are at that aroused state. But one thing to keep in mind about the arousal theory is that everybody has their own different levels of arousal. Again, back to my locker room exercise. Yes, he gives these speeches and everybody's kind of going crazy, but there's always kind of that guy in the corner that's kind of got his earbuds in, kind of got his eyes closed. He's getting aroused, but from a much lower level. Some guys need to jump around, they need to hit each other and go crazy and stuff. The arousal theory basically says that we all have these different levels of arousal, and you've got to find what's called your optimal level, whatever works best for you. You may be one of those people that does have to jump around and go crazy and be super excited and be super energized. Some people, however, kind of need to be at that level where they're just kind of, they're kind of relaxed or whatever. Because what happens, I know sometimes I used to give these great speeches in my locker room on the soccer team, and I think, oh man, and they're all jumping around, they're all excited, and they run out on the field, and they're so aroused that they screw up and they give up a goal in the first 2 minutes, and suddenly we're already down 1-0. That's a problem. You've got to find that optimal level where you're not too high and you're not too low. You've got to find kind of what works for you. Some people need to be at that high state. Some people need to be at that low state. And you've got to find that arousal level that works best for you. So again, this idea of optimal arousal, the Yerkes-Dodson idea. And the Yerkes-Dodson, and one of the things that's kind of an odd phenomenon about the Yerkes-Dodson idea of optimal arousal is that sometimes it is best when we have difficult tasks that we are at a low level of arousal, and when we are at easy tasks, we are at high levels of arousal. Now that may seem odd to you, but basically the idea is that when you have difficult tasks, you don't want to be super aroused because you need to focus. And when you have easy tasks, you kind of need to be aroused just to even do them because they are so simplistic. So the Yerkes-Dodson principle says that difficult tasks are best when we are at low arousal, and easy tasks are best when we are at high levels of arousal. In any case, there are two other theories that come to mind when we talk about what motivates people. One being the incentive theory, which basically says we just kind of wave carrots in front of you to get you to do stuff, whether that be you get to make the team, you get a better salary, whatever, so you're more motivated. Or you have the arousal theory, which says you've got to find that kind of optimal level of arousal that works for you to get you motivated to do things. If you recall, we have many different perspectives that are out there. One of the kind of touchy-feely, one of the hippie perspective, of course, is the humanistic perspective. Remember, the ring finger is humanistic. It involves relationships, it involves free will, and most importantly, it involves striving for your full potential. A guy by the name of Abraham Maslow, who was one of the two founding fathers of humanistic psychology, along with Carl Rogers, came up with an idea of what he believes is his belief is what motivates people, and he called these his hierarchy of needs. This is one of those big concepts in psychology. Everybody that studies psychology is very familiar with Maslow's hierarchy of needs. And as you can see here in this picture, there is a triangle. We'll use the triangle example here. There are 5 levels of things that ultimately will motivate us. And as you can see, we have to meet the ones at the bottom before we can move to the next level, etc., all the way to the top. And the needs at the bottom are far more important, and you have to have them, than the ones at the top, and they're much smaller. So at the bottom of the hierarchy of needs, as you can see, is what Maslow calls his physiological or survival needs. These are needs that everybody has to have. This is food, this is water. You got to have this. So first and foremost, you're motivated to find food, you're motivated to find water. Okay? And if you don't have those things, nothing else in the world matters. You will do whatever it takes to get food, to get water. Years ago, we had the hurricane that hit New Orleans, Hurricane Katrina. And I remember, New Orleans was cut off because there was so much water, and they were kind of almost like an island out there. And on the TV cameras, they showed lots of people, raiding the grocery stores and getting food and things. And people all over the country are like, oh my gosh, look at the people in New Orleans. They're such terrible people or whatever. Well, yes, I know there were people stealing TVs and stuff. That's one thing. But the people going to the grocery store, they were motivated to go to and get because they had to have food. They were cut off. They had to have food and water. So according to Abraham Maslow, first and foremost, what motivates us above all else is these physiological needs. We have to have food and water. Now, hopefully, you don't have to worry about that. You've got food on your table. You've got water. Hopefully, that's not an issue for you. So, fortunately for you, you move up on the hierarchy. You might be motivated at the next level, which is safety. Safety is you have to have a sense of security. Obviously, secure that you're in a home, you're in a neighborhood, that you feel safe, but it could also be financial security. You have to feel safe. And so you're motivated to do whatever it takes to get that sense of security. So if you live in maybe in a neighborhood that's a little bit suspect, maybe you keep a gun at your house. You keep things so you can protect yourself. If you are trying to, get to retirement or whatever, maybe you're making sure that you're socking away money every month, or you're socking money away for your children's college fund, or whatever the case may be. Safety needs is the second level. You've got to feel secure in your world. And so that's what's going to motivate you. So physiological needs have been met. Now you move to safety. You have to feel safe. Now, again, hopefully that's not a concern for you. Hopefully you don't have to worry about safety. So according to Abraham Maslow, you would then move up to the next level. And as you can see, that next level is what he calls his love, affection, and belongingness level. Everybody wants to feel loved. Everybody wants to feel a part of something. We want to be connected to somebody. And for a lot of us, if our physiological and safety needs are met, that's where we're headed next. We want to feel loved. We want to feel a part of something. That's why people join teams often. They may love the sport, but they like the team. They like the camaraderie of it. Sometimes people, will join a gang or a club that might be even a little bit suspect. People are like, gosh, why are they doing that? It's such a bad group. Because they make them feel important. They give them an identity. They make them feel a part of something bigger than themselves. Sometimes we talk about cults and why people join a cult and things like that. Because a cult gives them that sense of oneness with somebody else. We're united, we're together. And so Maslow argues that oftentimes we do whatever it takes to fit in, to be loved. That's why, oftentimes middle school kids oftentimes will conform. They'll do whatever everybody else does. They'll wear the same clothes. They'll dress the same. They'll act the same. They'll use the same swear words, whatever the case may be, because they want to fit in. They want to belong. You'll get into relationships at some point, and you may do things that you don't really like doing, but you want that person to love you. So you're going to do things to fit in. So Maslow argues that third stage on the hierarchy is this need to be loved, to be accepted, to have people think that you're important, and you want to belong. And so we're motivated to do whatever it takes to get that feeling of belongingness and love. If that is met, and let's be honest, a lot of us probably get stuck here. Teenagers, you probably are really stuck here. Sometimes I actually fall back into this phase because sometimes I want my students to really like me. I want them to think I'm funny. I want them to think I'm, the cool teacher or whatever. So sometimes I'm motivated to say and do things in class to get them to like me. But if you do have that need met, according to Maslow, you move up to the next level, which is he calls his esteem needs. Esteem needs are simply these kind of psychological need to feel like you're doing something that matters, that you feel good about yourself, that you are accomplishing things. Right now, I feel like this is where I am at in my career. I'm trying to do things to help my students, to do really well on the national test. So I'm motivated because if they do well on the national test, then I look like a good teacher. So I'm trying to do things that make me look good, that give me high self-esteem. I'm motivated to have my teams win because my teams win, I look good. And that sounds selfish, I know, but it's kind of the truth. These kinds of self-esteem. So we're motivated so that we feel like what we're doing is important, that we're doing something that matters. At the top of the hierarchy, according to Maslow, is something called self-actualization. Self-actualization is where you've basically reached your full potential. You are comfortable in what you're doing. You're not so concerned about how people view you. You're doing what matters to you. You're happy in what you're doing, etc. Maslow would argue that very few people make it actually to the top of the hierarchy of needs. He would use people like Martin Luther King Jr., or Gandhi would be an example of somebody that's truly self-actualized. They have reached the pinnacle. They are happy in who they are. They're comfortable in who they are. They've reached their full potential, and they have achieved that top level. Now, let's say that you're at self-esteem, maybe where I'm at, and suddenly something happens in your life and it knocks you back down. Maybe suddenly your house burnt down. Okay? You got a fire. Maslow would say you would drop all the way back down to whatever level. In other words, Maslow says we can go up and we can go down depending on the situation. We can't skip steps, but sometimes we go backwards and upwards. The hierarchy of needs is just wherever we are. Wherever we are in our life, that is what is motivating us, whether it's physiological or love and belonging, or maybe we've reached the top of the pinnacle, the hierarchy of needs. In other words, we have moved up and down, and this is his explanation of what motivates us. There are a lot of motivation theories out there. I think that Maslow's hierarchy of needs is one of the better ones because it's a very simplified, but it explains what motivates us and at what level. So we've been talking about motivation and what motivates people. There have been a lot of theories that we have covered and talked about, from hierarchy of needs to incentives to drive reduction, etc. And those are all great explanations of why we are motivated to do certain things. However, there are certain kinds of behaviors or biological functions that kind of are big motivating factors for us. One of the biggest, no big surprise, deals with hunger and eating. It is a big part of who we are. Food is a big part of what motivates. I mean, we talked about it in multiple theories, whether it was in the hierarchy of needs where you got to have food, or incentives. Some people do stuff because they want to get a steak dinner, or whatever the case may be. In any case, hunger plays a big part of motivating us and getting us to do things. Now, we're going to talk briefly about hunger and some of the elements of what hunger is, why it works, etc. One of the first things I want to make sure you understand, hunger does not come from your stomach. Do you have these pangs, these sounds, there's nothing more embarrassing than being sitting in the middle of a test. It's dead silent, and all of a sudden your stomach goes, you're like, ooh, stop doing that, stop doing it. And you like pound like that's going to make it stop or whatever. Those sounds do come from your stomach, those pangs, but hunger does not come from your stomach. Hunger actually comes from your brain. It is your brain, a part in your brain, that actually is responsible for making those pangs happen. And that part is your hypothalamus. If you recall, your hypothalamus, you have your brain stem. Your hypothalamus is inside the top of your brain stem, just below your thalamus. The hypothalamus is responsible for motivating factors like hunger, your sex drive, your body temperature, those kinds of things. But one of the big ones is that idea of hunger. What happens is your hypothalamus, when it thinks that you're hungry, it needs food, sends messages down to your stomach. And those contractions, when your stomach is contracting, and that's what causes that sound, we call that a pang. Okay? In other words, your brain is sending a message to your stomach, hey, we need to get some food here, and your brain, your hypothalamus, causes that specific pang to happen. Now, your hypothalamus is actually broken down into two kind of halves or parts. You have your lateral hypothalamus, and you have your ventral medial hypothalamus. Again, hypothalamus is that piece in your brain responsible for motivating factors, motivation, hunger, sex drive, etc. Your lateral hypothalamus, your lateral hypothalamus, when it is stimulated, it makes you hungry. So when your lateral hypothalamus is active, that means that you are hungry. Your ventromedial hypothalamus, when it is stimulated, it tells your body that you are in fact full and to stop eating. So lateral increases hunger, ventromedial stops hunger. Okay, all of it's part of the hypothalamus, but lateral encourages hunger, makes you feel hungry, ventromedial stops it. So, in some experiments that have been done, particularly on rats and stuff, we injected things and we destroyed the lateral hypothalamus of a person, of a rat. Okay? So remember, lateral hypothalamus, when it is stimulated, makes you feel hungry. So if that's destroyed, what's going to happen to the rat or that person? Well, if you guessed, if it's destroyed, you're never going to be hungry, and you're going to become ridiculously skinny and probably ultimately die. Same thing for another rat. If we destroy the ventromedial hypothalamus, we put a lesion on it or whatever, and remember the ventromedial hypothalamus tells you to stop eating, tells you that you're full. If we destroy that, what's going to happen to a rat or ultimately a person? Well, if you said they're never going to feel full, they're just going to keep eating and eating and eating, and they will become obese. And in the case of a rat, maybe eventually they die because they just get too big. Some people believe that one of the reasons that people become, obese is they've got a ventromedial hypothalamus that is messed up, or somebody that has an eating disorder like anorexia. It could come from lateral hypothalamus that tells them that they don't need food, etc. But in any case, ultimately hunger is dictated and directed by the hypothalamus. Lateral tells you to eat, ventromedial tells you to stop eating. Another piece of the hunger puzzle, though, involves, of course, the glucose. Glucose, and if you're not familiar with glucose, we talked about PET scans. Glucose is a sugar that kind of provides energy to body tissues. When glucose levels drop in your body, you become hungry. You need hunger to get that sugar going so that it can provide that energy. So another thing that is a sugar that kind of provides energy to body tissues. When glucose levels drop in your body, you become hungry. You need hunger to get that sugar going so that it can provide that energy. So another thing that people believe as far as hunger goes is that if you have lower glucose levels, then you're going to eat more. So if we can get more glucose in you, then you don't need to eat as much. So there's all kinds of diets and things that can try to get higher levels of glucose so that you won't then need to eat anything else. But glucose is one of those words that we need to know when it comes to hunger, because it is a sugar and it provides energy for your body tissues. So one of the last things that I want to kind of mention in just basics about hunger is something called the set point theory. The set point theory basically says that your hypothalamus almost acts like a thermostat when it comes to your weight. In other words, your lateral hypothalamus is activated when your body is underweight. We need to eat. We need to get more food in you so that you get your weight. And ventromedial hypothalamus is activated when you have eaten. In other words, your lateral hypothalamus is activated when your body is underweight. We need to eat. We need to get more food in you so that you get your weight. And ventromedial hypothalamus is activated when you have eaten too much and your weight has gotten too high, and so we slow down. In other words, the set point theory is the idea that we have kind of this set weight, approximate weight that we're supposed to be, at least a weight range. So set point theory is the idea that each person has kind of a set point, a body weight range that they're supposed to be at. And when they go below it, in other words, they get below their weight, their lateral hypothalamus kicks in, tells them to eat so that they get back. If they go above that range, their ventromedial hypothalamus kicks in and tells them to stop eating so they get back. So set point, kind of, it's a form of homeostasis basically. It's this idea that we're trying to keep your body in this weight range that is supposed to be. And that is the job of the hypothalamus, is to make sure that that in fact does happen. So again, hunger, obviously we do a lot of things to satisfy food. To satisfy our hunger. We eat, and then when we get too full, we stop, etc. But food is obviously going to be a motivator. But it's important that, and to understand food as a motivator, that you kind of understand some of the biological aspects of it, particularly the idea that the hypothalamus ultimately controls whether you are hungry or whether you are full. One of the problems that we put with hunger is that sometimes the motivation of hunger leads to some extremes. And it's kind of a sad commentary on our society, but we have obviously the extremes associated with hunger. We have people that suffer from eating disorders. Obviously they're really thin, but we have people that are obese and they are way overweight. So we're going to be looking at here briefly is just some of those basic eating disorders. You probably had a lot of this in a health class, but I think that it's important that you know some of the basics of these eating disorders, what they are, why they happen, etc. Let's start with our first one, which is anorexia nervosa. Now, most people just say anorexia, but the psychological name is anorexia nervosa. Basically, this is a condition where a person of normal weight, usually adolescents and oftentimes women, will lose weight because from their perspective, they are overweight. Even though they look completely normal, they look in the mirror, they see they see fat, and they want to be thin. Even though they're really normal, they see themselves as overweight, so they basically self-starve themselves. Anorexia is basically self-starvation. And so, again, it can be both men and women, but traditionally it's usually adolescent women that suffer from this. Anorexia nervosa usually hits in mid to late teen years, so like late high school. And again, it's where people think that they are overweight, and so they will self-starve themselves. They won't eat, they'll hide their food. They might even, exercise and stuff. They're trying to lose weight continuously, and that is anorexia nervosa. A lot of celebrities have gone through it, a lot of everyday people. I know for me, I had a friend in high school that suffered from anorexia nervosa. She had to be put into a eating disorder clinic to get, help and things like that. Another one is bulimia nervosa. Most people just simply say bulimia. Bulimia nervosa is also where you believe that you are overweight and that you want to be super skinny, but instead of self-starving yourself, you do a different method. You do what's called binging and purging. Binging is where you eat a lot of stuff because you're trying to hide it. You don't want people to realize that you're in fact, have an eating disorder. And therefore, so you eat regular or eat a lot, and then you have to purge. You have to get it out. That could involve things like sticking your finger down your throat and forcing yourself to throw up. It could be taking laxatives to get it all out. But in any case, right after you eat, you have to purge. You have to get it out of your system. So again, vomiting, laxatives, etc., are usually the number one ways that people will do this to get it out. So, I think most of you know what anorexia and bulimia is, but probably what you may or may not know is maybe some of the basic reasons for why people suffer from eating disorders. Well, there's two main kind of theories or ideas about it. First is kind of it's a biological thing. It's a genetic thing. So biological or pinky. These would people that say that eating disorders are caused by some sort of genetic disorder, some sort of biological process is causing this. Could be brain chemistry, could be any number of things. And to prove this, they have done twin studies. And what happens is, what they have found is that when identical twins are separated at birth, if one identical twin suffers from an eating disorder, the other one oftentimes does as well. Okay? So it has to be biological, as they weren't raised together. But when it comes to fraternal twins, remember, came from two eggs. They're just born basically at the same time. And they were separated at birth for any number of reasons. And one has an eating disorder. Oftentimes the other one does not. So that would indicate that maybe it has nothing to do, that it does have something to do with genetics, because the identical twins who share the exact same genetic code, because they came from one egg, both ended up being anorexic or bulimic, or whatever the case may be, where fraternal twins did not. That would give the genetic people, the biologic people, the proof that they need that it is in fact some sort of genetic problem, biological problem. However, the more common explanation for an eating disorder comes from much more of a sociocultural perspective. And again, socioculture is going to include family, attitudes, values, religion, etc. Oftentimes, people that suffer from eating disorders come from families that have very high expectations. They expect their kids to be the best in school. They expect their kids to be the best in sports. They expect their kids to be the superstars. And with all that pressure put on them, usually the adolescent goes, oh my gosh, I can't deal with this. I don't know what to do. I can't keep my grades up. I can't be the best on the team. So they look for something that they can actually control. And what they put into their bodies, i.e. food, is something they can control. And so a lot of people believe that people that suffer from anorexia or bulimia, it comes from kind of that family kind of dynamics, it's kind of a sociocultural phenomenon. In other words, the person that suffers from the disorder needs something that they can control. I feel like my life's spinning out of control. I don't know what to do. Well, one thing I can't control is the food that I take. And so they turn to that. One of the big times that we see the outburst of, or the onset of an eating disorder is late high school, early college. And so a lot of people say that shows the support or gives validation to that idea of sociocultural, because there's so much changing then. As you head off to college, suddenly you've got college, you've got work, you've got, you have all this freedom and stuff, and you don't know how to handle it all. And it's so overwhelming that you need to feel like you're in control. You feel like you're losing control, so you need to find something that you can control, and that's why they turn to food, because it's the one thing in their lives that they absolutely can control. One other little note about eating disorders is eating disorders are something that they can't just suddenly say, oh, I'm going to start eating. Parents are like, you just got to eat a candy bar. You just got to eat. It's not that simple. Somebody that suffers from an eating disorder, and I kind of mentioned about my friend in high school, oftentimes have to go to an eating disorder clinic. They have to go somewhere for inpatient stay to get treatment. First, biologically, they got to get food back in them. They got to force them to eat, whether making them eat and not letting them leave the table till they eat, or if it has to get to the extremes of using an IV, etc. They got to get them back to healthy. Then they got to tackle the psychological problems, usually through some sort of therapy, oftentimes with other people, group therapy, so that everybody feels like they're in this together. So eating disorders have to be dealt with, in most cases, in some sort of professional clinic where they can monitor what's going on, get you the help that you need, and get you the services that you need. and they can also monitor exactly what you're eating, and it's pretty strict. I know when I went to visit my friend that time, they had to make sure that I wasn't bringing anything into her, laxatives or anything like that that could help her hide food or get food out, etc. So again, we talk about those eating disorders. At the other end of the hunger spectrum, though, I guess technically it is an eating disorder as well, we just don't usually qualify it that same way, is this idea of obesity. Obesity, again, overweight people, doesn't take brain surgery to figure it out. This is just simply a disorder that is characterized by being excessively overweight. Now, unfortunately in our society, overweight people are just an easy target. We can make fun of them, we can laugh at them. We shouldn't, but oftentimes it's just one of those things we do. And it's wrong, but on a more serious note, besides the psychological effects, is the physiological effects. People that are obese have a lot of possible medical problems that can arise. They have high levels of cardiovascular disease, diabetes, hypertension, arthritis, you get it. There's a ton of things. And ultimately, it can lead to, just like an eating disorder, if eating disorder goes untreated, can end in your death, so can obesity. I am a product of an overweight parent. I had a parent, my father was extremely overweight and never took care of himself, eventually got diabetes, had all kinds of cardiovascular disease, had multiple open heart surgeries, and at the very young age of 56, ultimately, it took his life. So I have obviously a vested interest in obesity. Now, maybe I've gone to the extreme, because I am super thin, although I think mine's more about my metabolism than anything else. But obesity is a very serious issue, and it is a problem in the United States. We've got all these different ways we're trying to tackle it. I don't know if outlawing giant QT sodas is the answer, but there are lots of programs and things that we're trying to do. We need to get a handle on obesity because of those kinds of diseases and problems that arise from it. As we said, overweight people have a much higher and earlier death rate than those of people that are of normal healthiness. But also, unfortunately, there's a psychological and societal issue as well with people that are obese. It's kind of a sad fact. It's illegal, but a study was done in which women applicants went to apply for a job, used the exact same resume of a quote-unquote normal-sized woman, used the same name, resume, etc. And then another woman used the same stuff who was very overweight. Overwhelmingly, the quote-unquote normal-sized woman was hired more often than the overweight woman. Now, technically that's illegal. You can't base your hiring practices on appearance, size, etc. But we also know that, in fact, those kinds of things do happen. And it's kind of a sad truth. So obviously there's the physiological, there's the psychological, and there is the societal issues. In any case, eating disorders, whether they be anorexia, bulimia, or at the other end of the spectrum, the obesity disorder can cause a lot of problems, both physically, psychologically, societally, and ultimately can lead to your death. And so these are issues that need to be addressed either professionally, in a hospital, in a clinic, etc., to help people get the care that they need. Hopefully soon you're going to be graduating from high school and then going to college, or maybe not go to college, maybe go straight into the workforce. Either way, at some point in your life, you're going to join the workforce, full-time, part-time, whatever. You're going to be a part of, years and years of work. whether it be 10 years, 20 years, 50 years. Some people work a lifetime, but you're going to be working. Psychologists have studied a lot about how people are motivated within their work environments. And they've identified kind of some elements within the workforce that show or are elements of how we are motivated. First ones we're going to talk about are words we've had before, but they fit again here in the work area. And that is intrinsic motivation and extrinsic motivation. You're like, yes, I know what this is. It's a good review though. Intrinsic motivation. Intrinsic motivation is the idea that you are working and doing your job because you love your job. For example, I love teaching. I love being a teacher. I don't get paid all that much money. We all know that. That's kind of one of the sad truths about education. But I don't care because I love my job. I work. I come to work early, stay late because I'm intrinsically motivated. I like helping kids. I like seeing their personal growth, those kinds of things. I'm intrinsically motivated. So in some companies, hopefully you ultimately pick a job that you like doing. That's important. If you're going to work there the next 40 or 50 years, it better be something that you really, really like to do. So intrinsically motivated employees are those employees that simply like to do their job because they actually enjoy it. Some people, though, work because they're extrinsically motivated. They're working simply to get that paycheck or that benefit that comes with a job. A lot of people, I see it on Facebook or Twitter sometimes. People have a picture, they'll be on vacation, or they'll be at a lake house and they'll say something like, "This is the reason I work." Okay? Yeah, I guess, But again, is that the only thing that's getting you to do things? Is that the only factor that's getting you to get up, do your job on a daily basis? That's extrinsic motivation. That is the idea that you're doing something because you're promised a reward or you don't have to get punished. But in most cases in the workforce, you get something. You get more time off. You make more money. You get better insurance. You get some sort of things are waved in your face to get you to get up and do your job. So in the workforce, we talk about employees that are intrinsically motivated and extrinsically motivated. Intrinsic motivated employees probably are better because they actually like their job as opposed to those that are just there to get their paycheck. They're going to do the bare minimum and then they're going to bolt for the hills. A guy by the name of Douglas McGregor also did some research in regards to management styles. How managers of companies, CEOs of companies, whatever, run their companies. And he concluded that there are two basic management styles as far as how they kind of motivate their employees. He refers to these as Theory X and Theory Y. Now, I don't know why he couldn't come up with cooler, more specific names, but it's what he came up with. Theory X. So if you are a manager of a company and you don't actually call yourself, "Oh, I follow Theory X," you just simply, it's your philosophy. Theory X is the idea that you assume that your employees are basically lazy, that they are error prone, and that they're going to screw up some way. And so your job is that you stay on top of them all the time, and you only motivate them through extrinsic motivating factors. Okay? So if you follow the Theory X model of management, you are going to be of somebody who is basically just going to say, "Hey, if you guys work real hard today, we'll take off early an hour." Or if you work real hard today, for the next year, we'll say the next year, we'll give you a raise at the end of it or whatever. And so you motivate your employees through these kind of extrinsic factors because you assume that they're only there to get a paycheck or to get some benefit anyway. It's one way to run a company. The problem, though, that McGregor found was managers that subscribe to this theory oftentimes have to stay on top of their employees. They have to watch their employees all the time because they don't really trust them. They don't trust them to do their job, so they have to watch them constantly. So to try to get them to do better at work, they have to offer them more money, etc. Theory Y. Theory Y, according to McGregor, this is where the manager, the CEO, whatever, assumes that the employees love their job, want to be there, and therefore are motivated to do their jobs correctly. And so therefore, they kind of let their employees loose. They trust their employees. They trust that their employees are going to do their job. Now, I'm a school teacher. I'm at a school where my principal kind of subscribes to Theory Y. He lets me kind of do what I want in my classroom. He's not there watching me all the time. He's not checking up on me all the time. He knows that I'm doing my job. I'm teaching AP psychology to the best of my ability. I have kind of freedom to try some new things, etc. I have another friend who unfortunately teaches at a school where their principal subscribes to Theory X, constantly watching them, constantly making what he calls these walkthroughs, where he comes into the room and he just kind of stands in the back for a few minutes, once, twice, 3 times a week, because he doesn't trust his teachers. He constantly wants to put them on edge so that they feel like, oh man, he's going to be watching me. I better make sure I'm doing my job today. And he's constantly trying to give them incentives and things to do their job better. So again, 2 management styles. Theory X, where you don't trust your employees, you think basically they're lazy, so you watch them all the time, and you try to give them extrinsic motivators. Or Theory Y, you believe that your employees are there for the right reasons, you think they're going to do their job well, and you're going to kind of turn them loose to do whatever they need to. One last thing I want to mention about kind of the workforce in regards to motivation is something called flow. Now, flow is a term we use in psychology. You probably have heard the term like in the zone or something like that. Flow is the idea that we are so immersed, we are so deeply involved in our job, our profession, whatever, that we've kind of tuned out the rest of the world, and we are deep into our job. For example, there are days when I'm in my classroom and we're having such a great lesson and we're discussing and the interaction's really intense and it's awesome. All of a sudden the bell goes off and I'm like, oh my gosh, I didn't even realize where the time was, because I'm so immersed in what I'm doing. That is this idea of flow, that you're so immersed in it, you're so into it, everything's so good. Then there are other days where I'm teaching and I look at the clock and it hasn't moved in what appears to be for like 4 hours, because the lesson's just so bleh, I'm just not in the zone. Or, as we say in psychology, we're not in the flow. So flow is just kind of that term where we're so immersed into our work, we're so into what we're doing, that we are completely zoned out of everything else around us, and we're doing our job. As an employee, you hope that most of the time you kind of do experience flow, that you love your job, that you're into it, and it just continues to move. In any case, in the workforce, lots of ways in which we motivate people, whether intrinsically or extrinsically, and then managers have to decide, what's going to be my philosophy? Am I going to, not trust my employees or trust my employees? And ultimately, you hope the employees love their job enough that they find that kind of flow in their workforce or in their jobs. Do you ever just cry Come on, be honest. Have you ever just started bawling watching a TV show? You get all teary-eyed. Such a sad moment. Maybe one of your favorite characters has died or whatever. Or maybe at a game, you just go crazy and you start screaming and yelling and jumping up and down because your team is doing so awesome. We all exhibit different kinds of emotions. Emotion is just one of those elements that makes us, I think, human. It gives us kind of those feelings that we have. Well, psychologists have studied emotions a lot, and they have come up with these theories about, how emotions affect behavior and things like that. And we're going to get into that in this particular video. But first, let's just get a working definition of what emotions are. Emotions are our body's adaptive process or response. In other words, it's how our body adapts to certain things. We exhibit emotions when we're sad. We exhibit emotions when we're happy. We exhibit emotions when we're scared. You go through a haunted house and you're screaming and yelling. It's your body's way to adapt to a situation. So emotions are kind of our, adaptive response cycle that we do. Emotions are based on a lot of different things. There's a physiological aspect to it. There's the outward expressive side of it. There are a lot of elements that are included within emotions. So there are varying theories about emotions, how they are exhibited, why we do certain ones, etc. One emotional theory, it's not one of the more popular ones, but it's one that I do want you to be aware of. It's called the opponent process theory of emotion. The opponent process theory of emotion basically says that when we experience one emotion, that throws our body out of homeostasis. Remember homeostasis, but it's one that I do want you to be aware of. It's called the opponent process theory of emotion. The opponent process theory of emotion basically says that when we experience one emotion, that throws our body out of homeostasis. Remember, homeostasis is where we are even. Our body is kind of at an even, stable point. So we suddenly become ridiculously sad. So our body's now out of whack. Homeostasis, we're super, super sad. And the opponent process theory states that to get our body back to homeostasis, we have to almost immediately, it's like flip a switch and suddenly do the opposite emotion, okay? So, you're a football player and you're out on the football field and you just laid some guy out and, you knocked him out, like, yeah, and then you run over to the sideline and you and your buddies just start laughing and goofing around. That would be an example of the opponent process theory. You went from this anger, intense thing, but to get yourself back to homeostasis, your body quickly made you start being goofy and silly and sad. That brought you back to homeostasis. Another example, you're at a funeral and you're super sad and you're just so upset and whatever. And then all of a sudden you think of a funny memory about the person that died and you start giggling and laughing. And it almost feels like, oh my God, I shouldn't be laughing. I'm at a funeral. The opponent process theory basically says it's your body's way of going from one extreme to the other to get you back to homeostasis. It is this idea that emotionally we go from one to the other and it brings us back to this kind of even keel. But when it comes to the theories of emotion, there are really three major theories that everybody kind of looks to kind of explain emotions and how they are involved. First is what we call the James Lange theory of emotion. James Lange theory, which was proposed by a guy by the name of William James and Carl Lange, basically is the idea that there is first a physiological arousal, then the emotion. Let me say that again. James Lange, physiological comes first, then the emotion. Can't remember if I've told you this story before. I've told you lots of stories throughout these videos. But one time I was driving down the road and a deer shot out in front of my car. Okay, I think I told you this once, talking about the sympathetic nervous system. Okay, so first is that physiological arousal. Suddenly my body went, oh my God, and suddenly my body just shoots up with energy and my heart rate, blood pressure, etc. So physiological came first, then the fear of hitting the deer hit second. So the James Lange theory basically is this idea, physiological comes first, and that then leads to the emotion. Now, I'm not going to lie to you, I'm not a huge fan of the James Lange, because I don't think they happen in an order. I don't think one leads to another, but James Lange, through his research, seems to conclude that that is in fact what happens. Physiological, then the emotion. The second theory of emotion is what we call the Cannon-Bard theory of emotion, proposed by Walter Cannon and Philip Bard. Basically, what they say is that James Lange is goofy, kind of like I do, and they say that no, physiological doesn't come first and then the emotion. Rather, they say they happen simultaneously. So the Cannon-Bard theory states that the physiological response and the emotion happen at exactly the same time. So when that deer shot out in front of me, yes, I went into a physiological state of arousal, but at the exact same moment, I got a sense of fear and scared that I was going to crash into that deer. That is the Cannon-Bard. They happen simultaneously. Physiological and emotion happen simultaneously. Then there is a third theory called the Schachter two-factor theory. The Schachter two-factor theory, and sometimes it's just called the two-factor theory. Basically, this theory proposes that there is a cognitive element that should be included when we talk about emotion. So basically what they say happens is that there is a physiological arousal, then there is a cognitive labeling or identification of what's happening, then the emotion. So let me say that again. Physiological happens, then you cognitively label what's happening to you. There is a theory proposes that they're simultaneously. Then there is a third theory called the Schachter two-factor theory. The Schachter two-factor theory, and sometimes it's just called the two-factor theory. Basically, this theory proposes that there is a cognitive element that should be included when we talk about emotion. So basically what they say happens is that there is a physiological arousal, then there is a cognitive labeling or identification of what's happening, then the emotion. So let me say that again. Physiological happens, then you cognitively label what's happening to you, then there is that fear or the emotion. Okay? So back to my deer example. So the deer jets out in front of me. Physiologically, my body is sent into a state of arousal, blood pressure, etc. And then I cognitively go, oh my God, my body's out of whack. I must be scared of something. That's the cognitive label. Then comes the fear. Maybe. I don't know. Could be the case. In any case, what they believe is there is this two factors that work together to make the emotion. The physiological piece and then the cognitive piece, which basically says physiologically we experience something, then there's this cognitive label of it, then that leads to the emotion. Okay, so again, those three major theories are James Lange, which is physiological comes first, then the emotion. Cannon-Bard says they happen simultaneously. Physiological and emotion happen at the same time. And then there's Schachter two-factor, which basically argues that you have the physiological, then you cognitively label it, and then you experience the emotion. In all three theories, though, I want you to understand that all those theories, your sympathetic nervous system is stimulated. Your sympathetic nervous system, remember, is your arousal nervous system. It's that fight or flight response. So again, when that deer ran out in front of me, fight or flight kicks in, my sympathetic nervous system kicks in, my body gets all aroused. Once I swerve and miss the deer, within a little bit, my parasympathetic, remember para, P-A-R-A, 4 letters, calm, I begin to calm down. So I want to make sure that you understand that emotions and the theories of emotion are connected to your sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous system. Now, there is a specific area in your brain that is connected to those emotions. Again, this should all be a review for you, but there is a system in your brain consisting of 3 parts that we associate with emotion. Do you remember what that system is in your brain? Don't remember? It begins with an L. The limbic system. The limbic system is that area of your brain that is responsible for emotion. And particularly, one element of the limbic system, your amygdala, is that key. It's like an almond-shaped piece. It's really critical, particularly for those strong examples of anger, rage, fear, etc. The limbic system in general is responsible for emotion, so it kind of sets off your James Lang stuff and Cannon-Bard and Schachter two-factor. And then your amygdala is the specific element that is for the rage and anger, etc. The last little thing I want to mention about emotion is something that I personally believe in, and that is something called catharsis. Catharsis is the idea that sometimes we have these feelings deep down inside of us, and it feels good to get them out. So catharsis literally means emotional release. It is good to sometimes experience catharsis. I always argue that if you keep stuff down inside of you, it's going to come out one way or another, either through catharsis, like an emotional release where you can control it, or it's going to come out like a bomb. You're going to blow up at some point. So catharsis is simply a word we use in psychology that literally means an emotional release. It's getting it out, whether that's crying, that's spilling your guts to a friend or a family member. It is a key element. So again, there are lots of theories about why we experience emotions, whether it be the opponent process, James Lang, Cannon-Bard, Schachter two-factor, etc. It's all related to physiological functions, particularly up in your brain. And whichever one you prescribe to is fine. It's just important that you understand those different theories of emotion. There are a lot of emotions that we could talk about and feelings that we experience, from anger to sadness to happiness to fear, whatever the case may be. But from a psychology standpoint, happiness is probably one of the most important ones. It's important that we talk about happiness, what makes us happy, because let's be honest, wouldn't you rather be happy than anything else? Some of you are saying, no, I just want to be sleeping. Okay, whatever. But happiness is something that's going to make you literally feel better. In fact, psychologists have studied it, and people who are happy perceive the world as safer, they perceive the world as a better place, as a place that they can be successful, etc. People that aren't happy don't see the world in that same kind of favorable light. So it's really, really important that we try to find that kind of happiness. One of the things that psychologists have found is that happy people have a tendency to help other people more. We call this the feel-good, do-good phenomenon. It's not brain surgery, but it is a phenomenon that we have identified. And again, it's called the feel-good, do-good phenomenon. Basically, what this idea is, that when you're happy, you're going to be more likely to go help other people. Might be as dorky as, oh, I'm happy today, and there's a little lady trying to cross the road. Okay, obviously. But it could also be as you're going to be more willing to volunteer at your school, your neighborhood, your churches, whatever the case may be. Happy people are willing to help other people. People that are angry, people that are sad are less likely to help other people. So it kind of makes sense. If you are the type of person that volunteers a lot and you do lots of things, chances are you're probably a happier person. So again, we call this the feel-good, do-good phenomenon. Basically, again, it's this idea that happy people are more willing to go out and help other people. Another thing that kind of goes along with happiness is this idea of subjective well-being. What does that mean? Subjective well-being is this self-perceived feelings of happiness or satisfaction within your life. In other words, if you are feeling good, then you have a much more positive outlook of the world. You're going to see that the world, your place in it, is a good thing. And so your subjective well-being is going to be more positive if you are happy. Positive psychology, which is an aspect of psychology that is growing, is this idea that we should be looking at the more positive elements of the world and our people in the world, etc. So positive psychology is the idea that we should be looking at all the goodness in the world. It's kind of a humanistic. It's that touchy-feely. Remember humanistic being the ring finger. You know, we're all striving for greatness and whatever. So to have good subjective well-being, this idea that you have happiness and you have satisfaction in your life, you need to find things that you like to do. We've talked about finding a job that makes you happy, finding that special person that makes you happy. All of those kinds of things are going to give you this kind of good subjective well-being, this sense of having happiness, that you are going to be in a good state, etc. Now, one of the things the psychologists have studied is when our happiness is at its highest point over the course of a day. Strangely enough, psychologists have found that we are at our happiest point at around 6 or 7 hours after waking up. So I get up at, say, 5:30 in the morning. My happy time would be around lunchtime, 11:30, 12, whatever for me would be at when I'm at my happiest. And I can't say for sure that is the case, but I am pretty happy around lunchtime. I'm always jovial and joking around in the lunchroom with my fellow teachers. I like to have a good time. We joke about TV, we joke about movies, we joke about our students sometimes. I know that's terrible, but it's the reality. So the reality is that it's around that time period that we have a tendency to be happier. Our emotional happy point is usually within that 6 or 7 hour range. Negative feelings or sad feelings don't seem to fluctuate nearly as much. So happiness kind of has a high point and then it begins to descend. Negative is kind of consistent. If you're negative, you're probably going to be negative pretty much all day. Happiness has kind of a peak to it, if you will. So our positive emotion may start out low, get high after that 6 or 7 hour period, and begin its descent. sad feelings, sad emotions are going to be more consistent throughout the day. But the one thing I do want you to understand, and this really isn't nothing for the test, this is probably more just for you, is that everybody has emotional ups and downs. There are times when we are happy and there are times when we are sad. It's part of the life experience, and it's a good thing. It's good to experience those range of emotions. Now, you want to be happy as much as you can, but the reality is we all have these kind of peaks and valleys in our emotional experiences. But there are some predictors of what makes people kind of more happy. What makes people happier generally? Well, people that are happy usually sleep well. They get good night's sleep. They don't suffer from insomnia. They exercise. They get out and do stuff, whether it be at a gym or just going for a walk. Oftentimes, people that are happy have some sort of faith. It doesn't say what faith. You could be a Muslim, a Jew, a Christian, or any number of other things, but have some sort of religious faith usually is something as well. They oftentimes, people that are happy often have close friendships. They have people that they can go to, that they trust, and they also have a satisfying relationship, whether that's a marriage or just somebody you're dating, but they have this kind of somebody that's special in their life. And finally, they have a tendency to be kind of more outgoing and agreeable. Now, if you're an introvert, doesn't mean you're not happy, but people that are outgoing have a tendency on scales and surveys and things to report higher levels of happiness. And people that are agreeable, I'm really agreeable. I just kind of go with the flow. I have other people that I teach with that are constantly combative, and they seem miserable to me all the time. Now, don't get me wrong, I challenge some ideas sometimes, but for the most part, I'm pretty agreeable and kind of go with the flow. In any case, happiness is an element of and an emotion that we all need to have. We all need to experience. It's good for us. Psychologists tell us that happier people see the world in a much more positive light. And obviously, there are certain characteristics that that happy people have, and they're also more willing to help other people. Happiness is something you should try to be. Obviously, part of the emotional experience is we have happiness, we have joy, we have rage, we have whatever. But through all those emotions, sometimes we have conflicts with other people and sometimes even with ourselves. So we have kind of these emotional roller coasters that we kind of experience. Some of it could be related to stress, some of it could be related to just our emotional feelings that we have, etc. But psychologists have identified basically what they refer to as social conflicts. These are these kind of emotional ways in which our emotional feelings that we have, etc. But psychologists have identified basically what they refer to as social conflicts. These are these kind of emotional ways in which we're kind of being pulled in different directions. And we have to kind of resolve these conflicts so we can get back to an emotional well-being. They have a variety of different ones. We're going to go through the basic social conflicts and kind of give you examples of each. First is what they call the approach conflict. By the way, let's just do a quick thing here. Anytime in these conflicts you hear the word approach, that's going to imply something positive. When you hear the word avoidance, that's going to imply something bad or negative. So approach is always going to be a positive. Avoidance is always going to be a negative. So approach is a social conflict that you're given two options, and they both are going to end up being a positive, however which way you go. Approach means whichever way you choose to answer the situation or the occurrence, it's going to be a positive. Approach. So let's say tomorrow you get your letters from the colleges, and you open the first letter and MIT says, "Welcome to MIT." Good for you. Holy cow, that's great. Then you open your second letter and it says Harvard. Congratulations, you've been accepted to Harvard. So your decision is, do I go to MIT or do I go to Harvard? Oh, poor baby. You get to go to Harvard or MIT. Wow, that's tough. They're both such great schools. In other words, your outcome either way is going to be positive. It's good. You're either going to end up at MIT or you're going to end up at Harvard. That is approach. This idea that both alternatives are positive. The next one is what we call approach avoidance. This would imply that depending on the conflict, whatever the situation is, one outcome could be positive, but there's also a negative consequence to it as well. It's one of each. Okay? So a conflict that has a situation that has both an attractive outcome, but also a negative outcome. So you are somebody that is looking at a diner, and there's this wonderful, awesome, super rich, chocolatey mousse dessert thing that you know is going to be amazing. It's going to taste so awesome. It's going to be heavenly. But you also know that it's got about 8 trillion calories, and it's going to screw up the diet that you're on. Okay? Ooh, I really want it, but I know there's in other words, that is this idea of approach avoidance. There is a positive, it's going to taste delicious and it's going to be amazing, but there's also a negative side to it. This idea that it might affect your diet, it's got too many calories, etc. That is approach avoidance. The third type is what we call avoidance. In other words, negative. Your conflict ends in negative, however you seem to look at it. So, let's say, God, I hope this isn't you, but let's say that you are somebody that commits a crime. You kidnap somebody. Please don't go out and kidnap anybody. But let's say you kidnap somebody in one state. Okay, you kidnap a kid. And then you are like, oh my gosh, the state police are looking for me. They want to get me. The state troopers of that state are all out to get me, etc. If they catch me, I'm going to prison. So I decide, I'm going to be smart. I'm going to get out of this state. I'm going to drive across state lines and go into another state. So now you've crossed state lines. Now you've committed a federal crime, because by kidnapping and taking somebody across state lines, that is a federal offense. So now your outcome is you're going to get arrested and go to state prison, or you're going to get arrested by the feds and go to federal prison. It's bad either way. In other words, your consequences, there is no positive to this. It's negative. Either state prison or federal prison. That idea is this idea of avoidance. There are two negative outcomes. And then the last one is what we call the double approach avoidance one. Double approach avoidance. Basically, this is just the idea that there are multiple good things about a situation and multiple bad things about the situations. So let's say that you get an acceptance letter to go to wherever you live, a faraway school. So you get accepted to the University of Florida, okay? So as a kid, you're like, man, I get to go to Florida. It's going to be beaches. Plus, I get away from my family. I'm so sick, I got to get away from my family. So multiple positives, but there are also some multiple negatives. You got to pay out-of-state tuition, which is going to cost you a fortune. And you got to say goodbye to all your childhood friends. That would be rough. In other words, double avoidance approach, yes, I said it right the first time, is that there are multiple good and multiple bad scenarios in that outcome. In any case, psychologists have identified these kind of social conflicts that kind of tear us up emotionally. Do I give in to the good? Do I give in to the bad? I know there's both sides, or maybe it's all good, or maybe it's all bad. But the bottom line is, one thing I definitely want you to remember, approach is always a positive, avoidance is always a negative. You just put them together in the scenarios, and you can figure out the social conflict. Right now, you're trying to get through these videos, try to answer the questions and the problems, and try to be successful. Ultimately, hopefully you're going to take the national test. You're trying to graduate. Maybe you're trying to ask out somebody on a date. Maybe you've got a lot of homework to do. Maybe you've got a job. Maybe you're fighting with your parents. Any of these things can cause you to exhibit stress. Stress is one of those kind of terrible things that we all have to deal with at some point or another. Some of us deal with it all the time. Some of us can avoid it some of the time, but in any case, all of us deal with stress at some point or another. Stress is one of those things that we do have to deal with. Stress basically is any circumstance, real or perceived, that threatens our well-being. Now, I want to make sure you understand that. It could be real, like somebody's holding a gun to your head, that is real stress, or perceived. Well, you know, if I don't do well on this test, my mom's going to be mad at me. Yeah, maybe that's real. Maybe you just think that's going to happen. Gun to your head, that is real stress, or to deal with. Stress basically is any circumstance, real or perceived, that threatens our well-being. Now, I want to make sure you understand that. It could be real, like somebody's holding a gun to your head, that is real stress, or perceived. Well, you know, if I don't do well on this test, my mom's going to be mad at me. Yeah, maybe that's real. Maybe you just think that's going to happen. In any case, stress is any time, and oftentimes causes physical illness. It causes us to experience things that are just awful. So again, stress is any circumstance, real or perceived, that threatens a person's well-being. There's an area of psychology that really has begun to tackle a lot of issues related to health, but primarily stress, and we call this health psychology. Health psychology is an emerging field in which they want to look at preventing illness through physical health. What can we do to help you not experience certain illnesses and things? Are there some preventive things that we can do? And even if you do get an illness, what are some things we can do to help you deal with it? And one of the biggest areas that health psychology is tackling is the area of stress, because stress is such a big part of our culture. It's a big part of our life and a big part of our experiences. So what are some stressors that are out there? Well, we named some earlier, but stress basically is anything like an uncontrollable event, something that you feel like you can't control. Suddenly you get a pop quiz. That's going to cause you stress. Unpredictable events are stressors. Suddenly a relative of yours passes away. That would be something. Traumatic events, like suddenly you're involved in a car wreck. That's going to cause you stress. Internal problems, internal conflicts, internal issues. Basically anything can cause you stress if you believe, whether it's real or perceived, that it's going to cause you some sort of issue and it's going to affect your well-being. So basically the idea is, how are you going to handle those stressors? And that's one of the things that we're going to be dealing with in this unit. But one of the things that I want you to understand is, one of the easiest ways to understand how to deal with stress is to understand and to identify what personality type you are. Are you a type A personality or a type B personality person? Because that's going to have effect on how you deal with stress. Type A people. Type A people are competitive, hard driving, they got to be the best, they always got to be in control type personality. I'm a quintessential type A. I got to have everything going. I've always got like 50 things in the fire at once. I'm coaching, I'm teaching, I'm raising a family. I like to go out on the weekends. I like to do stuff. I'm always watching another Netflix series. I got a lot. I'm constantly go, 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 go. Usually people that are type A are going to be very aggressive in nature. Oftentimes they're prone to anger outbursts. I sometimes, it doesn't probably come across the camera, I'm like, oh, Mr. Anderson's so cheery. And pretty much I am. But every once in a while, I am like a ticking time bomb and I'll explode. That is type A. Type B is going to be much more easygoing, laid back, kind of go with the flow kind of person. They're going to be a lot calmer. So, stressful situation emerges. Put a stressful situation, somebody that has type A, probably not going to handle it well, because they have their lives figured out, they're going, and that stressful situation comes in and messes them all up, and it just, oh my gosh, and they can't deal with it. Type B people, when they encounter a stressful moment, okay, it's part of the life experience, easygoing, etc. So my wife and I have been married now for 20 plus years. I'm type A. My wife, type B. Very easygoing, very relaxed. So when stress hits our family, it could be any number of things. Something happens with our kids, something happens with our jobs, whatever. I freak out and I go, oh my gosh, what are we going to do? This is terrible. How are we going to handle this situation? My wife, on the other hand, it's okay. Take a deep breath. Maybe she starts jotting down some ideas, and I'm bouncing off the walls and freaking out. So again, when it comes to stress, your personality type is going to have a great influence on that, whatever type you are, whether A or type B personality. In any case, stress is one of those things that causes us to have an effect on our well-being, and sometimes it's real. Sometimes it's simply perceived. In any case, stress is one of those things that gets at us, eats at us, and sometimes can lead to some pretty serious consequences. But hopefully, over the course of your experiences, you're learning how to deal with and cope with stress. Stress is one of those things that we have been dealing with throughout time, throughout history, etc. It hasn't been until the last 30, 40 years, though, that people have really began to recognize that stress causes some major issues, and we need to look at it and try to figure out what it is, what's causing it, how to cope with it, etc. In the 1970s, a guy by the name of Hans Selye, I think that's how it's pronounced, proposed what he calls the general adaptation syndrome. Basically, he believes that these are 3 phases that every person goes through when they experience an aspect of stress. When stress kicks in, every person goes through these 3 very distinct phases or stages or whatever you want to call them, and everybody experiences them. The first stage of his general adaptation syndrome is simply what he calls the alarm stage. The alarm stage is where our immediate reaction to stress is to kind of like fight back and to freak out and go crazy. Hence the name alarm, like an alarm in a say a firehouse or whatever. An alarm goes off. Suddenly we are immediately awakened to the so something happens to us and we immediately begin to freak out. Everybody freaks out differently, but there's this kind of alarm where our first thing is to kind of fight or flight. Are we going to tackle this or are we going to run from it? And so this alarm phase, stage 1 or phase 1, is the first step in our dealing with a stressful situation. The second step in the general adaptation syndrome, or the second phase, is what he calls the resistance phase. The resistance phase is where we've gone through the alarm phase where we freaked out and we were awoken to that there is an issue, there's a problem, a thing's been brought to our attention, whatever. The resistance phase is where we cope with it. Now, he doesn't say how we cope with it. Some people may cope with it by turning to alcohol. Some people may cope with it by saying, okay, let's tackle this. Let's get right at this. Some people, hey, we're going to run away from this problem, whatever the case may be. But the resistance stage is where we're going to basically adapt to the stressor. We're going to try to figure out how to cope with it. We're going to deal with it, and we're going to make the most of it. And again, it could be a positive outcome where the stress goes away, or maybe we make it just worse, or maybe we make it, we just hide it away. In any case, when we go through the resistance phase, we are simply trying to adapt and ultimately cope with that particular stressor. The third phase of the general adaptation syndrome is what we call exhaustion. This is after we have coped with the stressor, we've dealt with the stressor, doesn't matter the outcome because he says he doesn't care about that, but we've gone through it, and because we had to deal with some sort of stressor, we are physically and emotionally exhausted. We are tired. Our body is worn down. According to Selye, our bodies take a beating when we're stressed. And at the end of having to deal with a stressful situation, our bodies are physically and emotionally exhausted from having to deal with such a intense kind of experience. A lot of that comes from kind of that physiological side. Our bodies having to release, all kinds of hormones into our body to help us battle these stressors. Emotionally, we've had to deal with all kinds of things, etc. But we've had to deal with these, and it's caused us to be physically exhausted. So the general adaptation syndrome basically is Selye's argument that when we deal with stress, we go through 3 very distinct phases: the alarm phase, the resistance stage, and the exhaustion phase. I do want to mention one last little thing, though, about going through stress, and it is connected to the general adaptation system or syndrome, is that stress obviously affects our health. Selye even identifies that our bodies are physically exhausted and emotionally exhausted for that matter. But one of the things that we see is that stress leads to things like coronary heart disease, because it takes so much to try to deal with it, and the exhaustion of it all of those things lead to that. So people that have high levels of stress have elevated blood pressure, which in turn leads them to have coronary heart disease. And if you don't know what coronary heart disease is, that's basically where your arteries and vessels are clogging up. and therefore your heart is not getting the nourishment and stuff that it needs. So part of one of the bad things about having to go through the general adaptation syndrome, and everybody goes through it, is that it does cause you to have some physiological issues, and coronary heart disease is just one of those. In any case, according to Selye, everybody deals with stress. Everybody has stress in their lives, and as we go through stress, we go through what's called the general adaptation syndrome. And the three phases of it again are alarm, resistance, and exhaustion. Psychologists have obviously been studying stress and its effect on people and its outcomes, and they basically have done a lot of research to try to help.
Okay, one Val game and then I'll be back. Peace.